Have you ever been judged before someone even knew your name? She arrived alone, 8 months pregnant, her belongings stuffed in a worn duffel bag. No one welcomed her, not even the man who'd just traded a horse trailer for her life. Her own mother made the deal, in a town where everyone remembers your mistakes longer than your birthday. Emily Ray was nothing more than Janet's girl damaged goods, passed along like a burden. But what would you do if the only person offering you shelter was colder than the Montana wind? What if your future, your baby's very survival, rested in the hands of a man too broken to care? This isn't a story of instant redemption. It's a story of silence, shared over soup, of fences fixed without words, and of one name, hope, that changed everything. Because sometimes, the people we fear are the ones sent to save us. And sometimes, healing begins not with forgiveness, but with being seen. So if you've ever wondered whether kindness still matters, or whether people can change, stay with us. What happened in Maple Hollow might just remind you of someone you once were, or someone you still could be. The girl came alone, belly full and heart empty, carrying everything she owned in a duffel bag and a paper envelope. The bus had dropped her nearly 2 miles back. She hadn't asked for directions. She didn't need to. The wind always knew where to go out here. Gravel crunched beneath her sneakers as she walked past the "Welcome to Maple Hollow" sign. Without looking up, her past had already waved goodbye. It was early April in Montana, but the air still had a bite to it. The fields were soft with thaw, patchy with snow, and the broken fences leaned like tired men. The sky held no warmth. Somewhere overhead, a crow called out once, like it recognized her, or warned her. At the end of the road, Will Carver stood by the fence post, arms crossed over a thick denim jacket. The wind flared the edges of his coat, but he didn't move. The horse trailer sat behind him, old, dented, barely roadworthy. He had traded it that morning for the girl walking toward him now. The truck that had dropped her off, driven by a woman with smoke-gray hair and a sharper tongue, had pulled away without as much as a backward glance. Janet Ray hadn't stepped out, hadn't said goodbye, hadn't left anything except the lingering scent of peppermint gum and resentment. Will didn't offer his hand. Emily didn't expect him to. He nodded once at the duffel. She dropped it with a soft grunt. The envelope, yellowed and soft at the corners, stayed in her hoodie pocket. "You'll stay in the south room," Will said finally, voice like cracked gravel. "Bathrooms across the hall. Don't touch the radio." Emily didn't answer. He didn't expect her to. The house was old and square. The paint on the porch peeled like dried birch bark. Inside, the walls held the smell of dust and burnt coffee. Emily's room was small, with 1 bed, 1 lamp, and 1 nightstand. The mattress springs creaked when she sat. No sheets, no photos, no softness. Will left her alone. She didn't hear him drive off, just the sound of the screen door clapping once behind him. She unpacked slowly. A few shirts, underwear, a crumpled receipt for prenatal vitamins, and the envelope. Inside it, folded once and taped shut, was a copy of the agreement, Janet's signature on one side, Will Carver's bold scrawl on the other. She placed it under the mattress. Downstairs, the smell of canned soup rose in weak plumes. She followed it like instinct. The kitchen was neat but bare, like no one had laughed there in a long time. Will ladled soup into 2 chipped bowls, pushed one across the table with a fork and sleeve of saltines. No grace, no talking. Emily dipped the spoon once, then paused. Will had already started eating. The soup tasted like metal and carrots. She was used to worse. They ate in silence. Not the awkward kind, the kind that made room for breathing, the kind that had lived there a long while. Later, she explored the barn. It smelled of old hay and machine oil. The radio on the workbench played some old country tune, barely audible. A foal whinnied in the back stall. Emily counted her steps from the barn to the porch. 47. She repeated the number like a prayer. When dusk slipped over the fields, she returned inside. The house creaked with the weight of old memories. She stepped into her room and turned on the lamp. The drawer of the nightstand stuck a little, then gave way. Inside, beneath a folded dish towel, was a knife. Not a kitchen knife. A hunting blade. Clean, sharp, heavy. She turned it in her hand, then looked toward the door. Will hadn't locked her in. He also hadn't locked the drawer. That night, Emily sleeps fully clothed, with one hand on her belly, the other on the knife handle. In Maple Hollow, kindness often comes with conditions, or worse, with whispers. The town looked washed out under the overcast sky, like someone had turned the color down just a notch too far. Spring hadn't properly arrived yet, just hints of green where snow had melted along the ditch and the scent of damp earth barely escaping the cold. Emily moved carefully down the cracked sidewalk, the scarf tight around her neck, hands tucked into the sleeves of her hoodie. She'd mended a hole in the left pocket that morning, with dental floss stronger than thread, and all she had. She passed the post office first. The door was propped open with a stone painted like a watermelon slice. Inside, Mrs. Laney was sorting mail behind the window. She looked up, caught sight of Emily, and went back to her stack with deliberate slowness. Emily didn't go in. There was nothing waiting for her anyway. Ruby's diner stood across the street, wedged between the hardware store and a shuttered beauty salon. A little bell jingled overhead as she pushed the door open. The warmth hit her like a wave bacon grease, burnt coffee, and floor polish. She hesitated at the threshold, willing her feet forward, inside. 4 older men occupied the corner booth by the window. Veterans, maybe. She recognized one from church flyers, another from the gas station. They stopped mid-conversation when she walked past. One leaned forward, eyes tracking her like a crow following a scrap of paper. Lois Harkins stood behind the counter, folding napkins. Her silver hair was pinned in a tight bun that hadn't moved since 1982. Her eyes narrowed the second she saw Emily, and her hands worked the napkins like they were trying to strangle something. Emily didn't meet her gaze. She kept her eyes on the stack of menus, on the specials chalked up above the counter. Meatloaf $7.25, cherry pie $2.95, coffee refill 50C. "I'll just take coffee," she said, her voice small but steady. Lois didn't answer. She reached for the pot and poured without a word, the stream thin and bitter-smelling. The cup hit the counter with a little clink. No cream offered, no sugar either. Emily set $2 down beside the mug, didn't wait for change. As she turned to leave, a chair scraped behind her. One of the men muttered something low, just enough syllables to sting. She didn't catch it all, but she felt it, like a slap made out of breath. Outside, the wind had picked up. She crossed to the gas station's restroom, the door creaking like it didn't want to open for her. The mirror was cracked at the edge. The sink dripped steadily. She stepped into the last stall, needing a moment of silence. That's when she saw it. scratched deep into the metal with something sharp. Maybe a car key were the words, "Janet's girl, no better." She stared at it for a long time, not angry, not surprised, just tired. She stepped out of the stall and washed her hands, letting the water run a little longer than necessary. On the way out, she adjusted her scarf again. It still smelled faintly like Janet's old perfume, cheap vanilla, and something too sweet. She hadn't noticed it until now. She breathed through her mouth. Will's truck was parked outside the general store. He sat behind the wheel, with his usual stillness, reading something folded, probably the Gazette. She climbed in. He didn't say a word, just started the engine and pulled back onto the road. They drove past the church, where a new sign had gone up. Grace is for everyone. Emily didn't smile. Neither did Will. Back at the ranch, she didn't go to her room. Not right away. She headed to the barn. The foal whinnied as she approached, ears flicking toward her. She reached out and stroked its forehead, careful and slow. It leaned into her hand, like it had been waiting. "I know," she whispered. "Me too." She stayed there until her fingers were too cold to move. Later, she found herself on the porch steps with Will. He drank from his stained thermos, steam curling in the air. The rocking chair creaked beside her, steady as a clock. "Back in town," she said after a long stretch of silence. "They've still got opinions." He didn't answer, just looked out over the field where the fence was still broken in 2 spots. The wind moved the grass like a hand smoothing sheets. After a while, she asked, "You think I deserve this?" Will folded his paper once. Then again, "Doesn't matter what I think," he said. "What matters is, you're still here." She nodded, but didn't speak. They watched the sky shift from gray to purple. When the sun disappeared behind the hills, they went inside. Emily changed into thicker socks and put her hoodie over a flannel shirt with missing buttons. The house was quiet except for the hum of the old fridge and a single moth tapping the ceiling light. She checked the room one more time before bed. She had cleaned that day, wiped down the dresser, folded the corner of the blanket. The knife still sat in the drawer, untouched. She didn't take it out tonight, just glanced at it before turning off the lamp. Then came the knock. It wasn't loud, just 2 soft raps against the screen door. Will opened it a crack, looked down, then back up, scanning the dark yard. No one, just a plain cardboard box, taped once across the top. No name, no writing, no sound. Inside, a brand new pack of diapers. Size 1, a folded note with no signature for the baby, from someone who understands. That night, a knock at the door, a box of diapers, left anonymously on the porch. Some fences are made of wood, others are made of silence. The frost hadn't fully given up its grip on the earth yet. It clung to the morning like a bad memory, biting the toes and fingertips of anyone foolish enough to meet the day too early. Will was already out by the time the sun reached over the ridge, tightening wire at the edge of the south pasture. The worn leather of his gloves creaking each time he pulled. The post leaned slightly, like an old man trying to hear better, and Will grunted as he worked it into place. Across the yard, Emily moved a broom across the porch with the kind of concentration usually reserved for brain surgery. The boards were already clean, had been since yesterday, but the motion gave her something to hold on to. A rhythm. She watched Will through the corner of her eye, the way he moved slow but sure. Every action measured, like he was fixing more than just a fence. Chet Rollins's battered truck rumbled up the drive, a puff of dust trailing behind like a bad omen. He jumped down from the cab, wiping his hands on a red rag that never quite came clean. He nodded once at Will, squinted at Emily. "Dry as tinder out there," he said, jerking a thumb toward the hills. "Fire season's coming early this year. Don't take much to spark something." Will gave a low grunt of acknowledgement and signed for the hay delivery with a pencil he pulled from behind his ear. Emily kept sweeping, though now her strokes were softer, slower. She knew Chet's kind, the kind that smelled smoke long before it showed, but never offered water. Later, after Chet drove off and the dust settled, Emily approached the barn. Will was moving bales, sweat staining the collar of his shirt. "I can help," she said, a little breathless, like she wasn't sure the words were allowed. He didn't say yes, but he didn't say no either. Just handed her a shovel and pointed toward the stalls. She got to work, scooping with careful precision, the scent of hay and old leather mixing in the air. Her back ached by the third stall, but she didn't stop. They worked in silence until the sun began to dip. The light turned golden, slanting through the barn slats, catching in the dust like glitter. Will leaned on a pitchfork and watched her for a moment. She didn't look up. Dinner was mac and cheese from a box, the powdered kind, served with a side of pickles and 2 glasses of tap water. They ate at the kitchen table with only the hum of the fridge and a distant owl breaking the silence. Emily didn't fill the quiet with nervous chatter. Neither did Will. It wasn't comfortable, exactly, but it wasn't uncomfortable either. Afterward, she wandered into the living room. The place was bare, except for a worn couch, an Afghan draped over the back, and a low shelf with some old books and a few dusty photos. One drawer stuck when she tried to open it. With a gentle tug, it gave way, revealing a photo she hadn't meant to find. A woman, mid-30s maybe, smiling in a way that made her cheeks crinkle. 2 kids beside her, a boy and a girl, maybe 5 or 6. They were on a porch swing, sunlight pouring over them like warm syrup. Emily stared at the photo for a long time. Then she slid the drawer shut without a sound. The next morning, Will motioned her toward the truck. She climbed in, unsure of where they were going. They drove to a back field she hadn't seen before, wide open, flat, with just enough dirt road to pretend it was paved. He got out and pointed to the driver's side. She blinked. "Me." He said nothing, just waited. She climbed in, hands trembling slightly. The seat was cold. The keys were already in the ignition. She started the truck and waited for instructions. "Second gear," he said simply. "Clutch slow. No rush." The first start was jerky. The second stalled out. He didn't raise his voice, didn't sigh, didn't even shift in his seat. Just let her try again. By the 4th time, she moved 20 feet without killing the engine. Her smile was small but real. That night, she sat on the porch again, feet bare, ankles tucked beneath her. Will sat beside her, a beer in his hand he barely drank from. The cows lowed softly in the distance. She could hear Meringue, the loud one, calling for her calf. "Do they always call out at night?" Emily asked. Will nodded. "Some do. Some wait till morning." She watched the stars blink to life, each one timid at first, then braver. After a while, she said, "You ever wish someone had just waited on you? Just waited long enough to understand?" Will didn't answer right away. He tipped his head back, looked at the sky like he might find the words up there. "Yeah," he said finally. "Once." She nodded. That was enough. She went to bed without brushing her teeth. The scarf lay folded on the nightstand now, no longer draped over the doorknob. She reached for her glass of water and stopped. Something sat on the edge of the table. A book, old, dog-eared. Spine cracked in 3 places. The Grapes of Wrath. She didn't hear him come in, didn't hear him leave it. But there it was. Will leaves a dog-eared novel on her table, The Grapes of Wrath. When the wind shifts west in Montana, you can smell trouble before it shows. It wasn't just the way the grass crunched underfoot or how the curtains stuck to the windows from static. It was the smell, thin and sharp, like iron filings riding the breeze down from the hills. Even the cows seemed to know something was off. They moved less, kept to the shaded parts of the pasture, lowing only when necessary. Emily stood on the back porch, one hand resting under her belly, the other shielding her eyes. The sky had turned a blistering gold, washed in that high desert hue that made everything feel both too close and too far away. The thermometer on the wall read 80 degrees. Warm for April. Too warm. Chet's warning played in her head like a stuck record. Dry as tinder, he'd said. Fire season's coming early. Inside the kitchen, she tried her hand at cornbread. The recipe came from a yellowed note card tucked in one of the kitchen drawers, written in spidery cursive that may have once belonged to Will's wife. She followed it to the letter, or tried to. But the batter came out lumpy, and the oven ran hot. 20 minutes later, the edges were charred and the center sunk. She almost threw it out. Instead, she cut 2 pieces, set them on the table, and poured water from the tap. Will came in without a word, dust in his hair, shirt damp around the collar. He sat down, took a bite of the blackened bread, and chewed. Didn't grimace, didn't praise it either. Just ate. Emily watched him, unsure whether to be offended or grateful. Needs less burn next time, he said finally, not looking up. It was the closest thing to encouragement she'd heard all week. That afternoon, she found him outside, coiling hoses and checking nozzles near the barn. A shovel leaned against the fence. Beside it, a tub, a wide metal thing that once held feed, now half filled with bottled water, blankets, canned beans, and a weather radio. Is it that bad? She asked. Will squinted toward the hills. Better to be ready than sorry. The wind picked up, sweeping loose straw across the yard. Emily rubbed her belly. The baby had started turning more, pushing up into her ribs with tiny jabs that stole her breath. She wondered if it could feel the tension in the air. 2. Later, she folded a few of her clothes, just enough for a bag, and placed them beside the tub. Will didn't say anything, but she noticed he'd added a flashlight and batteries since she'd last looked. Around dusk, she sat in the barn on a bale of hay, humming without realizing it. A melody half remembered from a shelter in Helena. Some lullaby another woman used to sing to her child. Emily couldn't remember the words, just the rhythm. It comforted her more than she expected. Will approached, something soft in his hands. This was hers, he said, offering a folded blanket, faded pink with ducks stitched along the edge. She used to carry it everywhere, even when she was too big for it. Emily ran her fingers over the fabric. It smelled faintly of cedar and thyme. She wanted to ask more who she was, what had happened, but something in Will's posture stopped her. He wasn't offering a story, just a gesture. That was enough for now. They sat like that for a while, man, woman, child not yet born, breathing in the dry air, saying nothing. The barn creaked, and somewhere beyond the hills, thunder rolled. At night, the electricity flickered twice before settling into a low, steady hum. Emily stood at her window, watching the sky. The stars were hidden behind clouds, but she could see flashes lightning leaping from cloud to cloud, distant and yet too close. Then she smelled it. It wasn't much, just a trace, but it was there. Smoke. She stepped onto the porch and scanned the horizon. The trees were dark silhouettes against a bruised sky, but to the northwest, beyond the ridge, a soft glow pulsed. She called for Will. He came out fast, binoculars already in hand. He looked, said nothing, then moved. 2 miles, maybe less. Started on Barlow's side. He muttered, grabbing his coat. The glow intensified, flickering like a giant match in the distance. Sirens hadn't sounded yet, but Emily knew they would soon. She backed into the house, heart pounding. Will moved with purpose, closing barn doors, pulling the tub closer to the porch, filling the truck's tank with extra gas. Inside, Emily paced, each step echoing louder than the last. Then something grabbed her from the inside. Not a kick, not a turn, a pull, sharp, low, deep. She gripped the edge of the table, breath caught between past and future. Her belly tightened, hard as a rock. Then again. Emily feels her first contraction. In fire and fear, a new name was born. The air was alive with noise, not from voices or engines, but from the fire itself, a low, growling roar that swallowed up the night. Sparks drifted across the pasture like fireflies with bad intentions. The sky had turned into something out of an old war film, painted orange and black, each gust of wind stoking the flames just a little closer. Will had barely gotten them into the stone shelter when his knees buckled. Emily caught him by the arm, but he waved her off. His face was gray beneath the soot, his breathing shallow. He coughed hard, and something red came up. She turned away to stop herself from panicking. They had no light now. The power had failed sometime after midnight, and the flashlight had died during their walk to the shelter. But the fire gave off its own glow, just enough to paint the walls in shadows. The heat was intense, even inside the thick stone structure that Will had once called a storm shack. Emily paced, then crouched, then stood again. Her legs wouldn't hold still. Her heart pounded like a drum. Another contraction came, stronger than the last. Her hands went to her belly instinctively. "No," she whispered, not to the baby, not to Will, but to the moment itself. Not now. But it didn't care. Nature had no calendar. The baby was coming. Will stirred, groaned, and tried to sit up, only to slump back against the wall. His eyes fluttered, then closed again. Emily moved to him, cupping his face. "Will, come on, stay with me." He opened his mouth, but only a rasp escaped. His hand fumbled at his coat pocket and retrieved a small, worn leather pouch. Inside was an old, curved pocket knife, smooth from years of use. He held it out toward her. Her breath caught. She took it without a word. Another wave of pain, sharper this time, ripped through her. She fell to her knees, pressing her forehead to the cool stone floor. The room spun. She crawled to the far side of the shelter, dragging a blanket behind her. The contractions came faster now, like clockwork without mercy. The world outside was burning, and the world inside her was breaking open. She gritted her teeth, clenched her fists. No one was coming. No nurse, no siren, no mother, just her and the baby. Between the agony, she remembered something an old woman once said at a shelter in Missoula. When it starts, it won't stop. You just ride the wave, and then you breathe. So she did. She rode it, screamed once into the smoke, bit her own hand, and when the final wave came, she bore down with everything she had. The baby slid free into a world of ash and firelight. Emily gasped, half in awe, half in exhaustion. She checked the baby's face, eyes squeezed shut, mouth wide open in a furious, beautiful wail. The sound was pure life, defiant and raw. Tears stung her eyes, not from the smoke this time. She tied the cord with a strip of cloth torn from her shirt, then used Will's knife to cut it. Her hands trembled, but she was steady enough. She cleaned the baby with a dry cloth and pulled Will's flannel shirt off his limp body to swaddle the child. It smelled of hay and aftershave. She whispered into the tiny ear, "You're here. You're really here." She looked around the shelter. In the low light, she noticed something etched into one of the stones. J.C. The letters were faint, carved by a hand that had once known love and loss. Will's daughter. Maybe. She leaned back against the wall, cradling the baby in her arms. Her body ached, her soul throbbed. But something had shifted. "I should call you Hope," she murmured, "because you were never supposed to exist. And here you are." The fire had started to pass, its hunger satisfied somewhere further north. The air in the shelter still crackled with tension, but the worst had moved on. Emily closed her eyes, just for a second. Then she remembered. Will. She crawled to him, gently shook his shoulder. "Will, wake up, please." His chest rose, but only barely. She placed a hand to his forehead, burning. She shook harder. "Will, don't do this. Don't you dare." No response. Will doesn't wake when she shakes him. Emily rinsed the bottle in boiling water one more time, even though it was already clean. Her hands were raw from scrubbing, but she preferred that sting over the ache behind her ribs. Outside, a weak breeze moved through the trees, now bare of leaves and color. It was the kind of wind that stirred ghosts, not branches. She turned the radio dial gently, skipping static and the preacher's voice, landing on a faint country hum. Will had left her to choose the station that morning. That small act, barely a flick of his hand, had felt like something more. Not forgiveness, maybe not trust, but space. She could live inside that space, if only for a while. In the bedroom, Will lay still but alert. His eyes flicked toward the ceiling, as if reading the cracks in the plaster. Every so often, he would cough, sharp and dry, and close his eyes like the effort cost him something. He'd scribbled something in the notebook Emily had placed on his nightstand, a date, today's, and a single word beneath it. Smoke. That afternoon, she sat at the edge of the porch, Hope cradled against her chest in the sling she fashioned from an old dish towel. The baby had stopped fussing, lulled by the radio and the rhythm of her mother's heart. Emily stared at the ridge where the fire had first crept down, remembering the red glow against the black sky, the smell of hot metal, the pressure of her own breath as she counted through pain. She didn't know how long she sat like that, just that when she blinked, she was crying slow, unremarkable tears that didn't shake her shoulders or twist her throat, just falling. That evening, she opened a cabinet in the hallway and found boxes of buttons, dozens of them, sorted by size and shape, as if someone once thought these small circles might be useful again. She imagined Will's wife hunched over these, matching shades to collars. The thought made her smile, then ache. Hope whimpered. Emily adjusted the sling and began to hum, softly the same lullaby she'd once heard through a paper-thin shelter wall in Billings. Something about stars and safe places. She didn't know the words, only the rise and fall. That was enough. When the kettle whistled, Will shifted on the cot. Emily poured water over the tea bag she'd saved for a day like this. Mint, faint but real. She placed the mug on the side table near him. He didn't reach for it right away, but he nodded. She turned to leave when she saw the paper under the mug. 3 words written in Will's all-caps scrawl, "Thank you, Emily." She stared at it for a full minute before folding it in half and slipping it into her flannel shirt pocket. It felt like currency, heavier than a coin. Later that night, as she rocked Hope near the fireplace, the embers low and pulsing, she whispered her own name aloud, not in sadness, but as practice. Then the baby's, then his, Emily, Hope, Will. 3 names not bound by blood or law, but by something slower, older like roots under frost. She shifted slightly and felt the paper crinkle in her pocket. The baby breathed against her collarbone, warm and stubborn. Across the room, Will stirred, opened his eyes, and stared not at her, but at the small bundle she held. He didn't speak at first. Then he whispered, "She looks nothing like the past." Lois never liked being wrong, but she hated being unkind more. She parked 3 houses down from the Carver Ranch, left the engine running while she debated. The pie box sat on the passenger seat, its lid slightly warped from age and humidity. It had belonged to her mother, used back when Gibson Bakery was still open on Main. That had been years ago, before the new gas station came in, before Janet Ray had stirred up the town's gossip wheel again. Lois stared at the white blossoms on the apple trees lining the dirt road, then at the faint tire tracks where the fire trucks had once parked. She tightened the ribbon around the box not too tight, just enough so it wouldn't flap in the breeze, and stepped out of the car. No note. She had written one, then crumpled it. There were too many things to say, and none of them came out right. She set the box on the ranch's front gate post, brushed a leaf off the top, and walked back to her car without knocking. The pie was still warm. That would have to say enough. Inside the ranch house, Emily paused in the hallway, with Hope tucked to her chest, still swaddled in the flannel shirt. The knock hadn't come, but the soft creak of the gate had stirred Will, who now stood by the window, steadying himself with one hand on the sill. "It's still warm," he said without turning. Emily blinked. What is Will nodded toward the porch. She opened the door cautiously and saw the box. The ribbon caught the breeze like a flag waving surrender. She brought it inside, placed it gently on the kitchen counter, and opened it to find a perfect peach pie, golden, laced with lattice strips, sugared edges crisp. She hadn't seen a pie like that since before the shelters, before her mother's hands got too tired or too distracted to bake. There was no note, no initials. Emily waited until Will left the room before cutting into it. She didn't eat it all, just one small piece, enough to know it wasn't store-bought. 2 days later, Billy Carter showed up at the gate. He had curly hair and one missing front tooth. He held a plastic cow, scuffed and missing a leg, and wore yellow rubber boots that squished even though the ground was dry. "I want to see Meringue," he declared. Emily narrowed her eyes. "Who told you about Meringue, Mom?" "She said you name your cows like pies." "That's funny." Emily didn't smile, not right away, but she opened the gate. Billy followed her to the barn, bouncing with every step, dragging the cow toy by its tail. He wasn't shy, but he was polite asked before petting the old milk cow and whispered something to her ear before stepping back. "She's nice," he said. Emily said nothing, but that night, she cleaned up the toy and set it on the windowsill in the room across from hers, just in case he came again. That evening, while feeding Hope on the porch, Emily started talking aloud. Not to the baby, really, just to the sky. Once, there was a girl who didn't have a house. Not really, just places where she was allowed to be for a little while. She paused. The baby's eyelids fluttered. She got passed around like hand-me-down shoes. Too tight, too used, too stained to want. The screen door creaked. Will stepped out but didn't interrupt. He just sat nearby with his thermos, watching the shadows stretch across the gravel. And then she got left somewhere. Emily continued, but instead of being scared, she learned how to stay. Hope made a soft cooing sound. Emily looked down and smiled, brushing a speck of ash from the blanket. The wind smelled of wildflowers and old smoke. The next afternoon, Lois came herself. She didn't knock, just stepped onto the porch with her hands in her jacket pockets. Emily stood, startled, Hope sleeping against her chest. "I came to see how she's doing," Lois said. Emily opened her mouth to reply but stopped. Lois gestured toward the bundle. "The baby." Emily nodded. "Her name's Hope." Lois hesitated. Then she said, "That's a good name. For a girl born after a fire." Emily waited. Lois cleared her throat. "I remember Janet when we were kids. Always louder than needed. Always in trouble." She looked at Emily. "You don't remind me of her." Emily looked down. Her hands trembled slightly. "You're the mother of baby Hope," Lois added. It was the first time anyone in town had addressed her that way. Not as Janet's girl. Not as a mistake someone else made. Just who she was. Emily nodded. "Thank you." Lois stepped closer. Her hand reached out slow, stiff, and hovered for a second before closing gently around Emily's fingers. Her grip was neither soft nor strong, but it stayed. It didn't pull back. It simply held, inside the house. The baby stirred. The radio hummed a low, familiar tune, something about sunlight and simple places. And on the porch, in the middle of a town that had once turned away, two women stood together for the first time, the space between them bridged not by words, but by pie and presence. At 5:12 a.m., the phone rang. It hadn't rung in months. Emily blinked awake, startled not by the sound itself, but by the wrongness of it. The rotary phone in the kitchen, usually more ornament than object, let out its fourth ring before Will picked up. She heard his low, raspy voice, not quite his own. Then silence. She slipped out of the bed, careful not to wake the baby. Hope stirred, but didn't cry. The early light filtered through the curtains, cold and gray, a world still holding its breath. Emily moved across the hall to check on Will. He stood in the kitchen, the coffee pot suspended mid-air, unmoving. One hand held it, the other hovered above the mug. His hand trembled first, a quake, then a slow, almost sad tremor. She reached out. "Morning," she said softly. He didn't turn. "Neck's cricked," he muttered. "Probably just slept wrong." She moved closer, noting the pallor of his skin. "You missed by 2 inches," she said quietly. Coffee dripped onto the countertop. Will set the pot down and cleared his throat. "Fine, I'm fine," he said, but the words rattled. Emily didn't argue. She cleaned the counter, folding a kitchen rag over the spill, inside. She found herself measuring the silence. Too loud. Too long. The day wore on. Will moved slowly, pausing to steady himself against the cabinets. The table, even the doorframe. Emily followed him with her eyes, offering water, then tea, then silence. That night, when she fed Hope under the porch light, she watched Will's silhouette by the barn. He stood too quiet, too still. She didn't speak. She just listened to the whisper of the breeze, the soft creaks of his body against the night. She didn't sleep well. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw his hand shaking, the coffee spilled, the creak of the barn door. She awoke as usual, before the sun. When the day broke over the ranch, it was too still, like everything had been paused. She walked through the house, humming the lullaby she'd started learning for Hope. It helped keep the tension out of her chest. She found Will half collapsed in the hallway, his back leaning against the wall, head tilted toward the ceiling, his legs tangled awkwardly, as if he'd tried to walk and suddenly couldn't take another step. Will, she cried, rushing to his side. His eyes opened, clouded, unfocused. His mouth sagged at one corner. "No," Emily said, scrubbing a sleeve against her eye. Hope stirred at her chest, nestled close to her heart. She held the baby safe and dialed immediately. 911. "What's your emergency?" "My husband, he's having a stroke. He's awake but struggling. We're at Carver Ranch, County Road 6. "Yes, please hurry." She swept Hope into a handmade sling, the same one that had supported her through contractions and smoke. She'd tie it securely against her shoulder. By the time Jim arrived, the early morning sky was pale rose. The ambulance wheels stirred ash on the drive, reminding Emily of the fire. Jim knelt beside Will, scanning quickly, voice low but urgent. Emily stayed back, holding Hope, her own breaths even. She watched Jim press the defibrillator pads, then speak in clipped phrases. "Alert, speak his name." "Will," Emily said softly. The man on the gurney stirred, responding. Jim nodded. "We're good, but if we'd waited 15 more minutes, he wouldn't have seen the sun today." Emily felt a tremor in her chest. She knelt beside the stretcher and brushed Will's cheek. "I got you," she whispered, voice steady, but her heart pounding like a freight train. Will's fingers twined with hers. He didn't speak, but his eyes held a gratitude she couldn't name. He looked at Hope, small and wrapped in cloth, blinking up at her. The siren sounded, gentle in the quiet dawn. Emily climbed into the back of the ambulance with Hope, while Jim slid the stretcher inside. She held his hand as the door closed behind them. They rattled toward the highway. Emily felt every bump in the road, every jostle of the baby. Outside the window, maple trees bent under a gentle breeze. Neighbors walked to their gardens, greeting the morning. Mrs. Carter was already out, making small talk about sunshine and zucchini. Hope nuzzled closer. Emily tucked the blanket tighter. They reached the hospital before the sun broke the horizon. As Will was wheeled inside, he held her hand, like he wouldn't let go. His gaze never wavered, unblinking until the door closed. Emily stepped outside with Hope pressed tightly. The air smelled of dewy grass and antiseptic. She took a deep breath. No tears yet, just resolve. The first ambulance siren of the day faded into the distance behind her. And there, in the quiet of dawn, Emily felt something change. She was no longer the girl being saved. She was becoming the woman who would save. Hope learned to crawl on a porch that still smelled like smoke. It wasn't much of a porch. 2 planks had needed replacing after the fire, and one corner still sloped slightly, where the support beam had burned. But Emily sat there every morning, cradling a chipped mug of warm milk and humming to her daughter, while the sun slid gently over the hills. Hope liked the breeze. She would kick her feet and squeal when it lifted the edge of the quilt, as if the wind were an old friend come calling. The ranch had begun to heal, though not evenly. The far pasture was still scorched, the coop was gone, and the barn bore a black line where the flames had once kissed its beams. But a cluster of yellow wildflowers had grown along the fence line, bright against the soot-stained earth, refusing to wait for permission. Emily no longer waited, either. One warm morning in August, she laid out a sheet of paper on the kitchen table, tugged out a worn pencil, and began to draw. Not buildings or barns or walls, but circles and curves, scattered like stars. Flowers, bushes, a swing, a place for a bird bath. At the center of it all, in capital letters, smudged by her palm, she wrote, Hope's Garden. Will watched from his usual spot by the window. He didn't comment, just sipped his decaf from the same battered thermos and ran his thumb over the wood grain of the table. Emily held the paper out to him. It's not much, she said. He looked at it for a long time. Then he nodded once. That afternoon, she hammered in the first white slat of a new fence. Will, still unsteady, came outside with his cane and settled into the porch swing. It had been repaired quietly. Nails straightened, ropes retied, the seat sanded smooth. No one had claimed the work. It had just appeared. The next day, Chet pulled up in his rusted pickup and handed her a jar of nails and a half-used paintbrush. Figured you could use a hand, he said, dropping a bag of fresh bread on the porch. Or 5. Behind him came 3 other truck's neighbors who hadn't spoken much during the fire, hadn't said anything when Emily first arrived, but now came with saws and smiles that didn't need words. Lois didn't come, but Billy ran out of their truck waving a plastic shovel. Ti konter nung si uochen nako, he shouted, mispronouncing it so badly that Emily laughed out loud. Hope squealed at the noise. She sat upright, wobbly but proud, clapping her small hands. They worked all morning. Emily painted fence posts white. The men trimmed back branches, and Billy planted weeds as if they were rare tulips. Will sat in his swing, cane across his knees, eyes following every movement. He didn't speak often, but when he did, it was to remind someone to mind the root line or don't overwater the west corner. He was still a rancher, still needed. Around noon, a letter arrived. A simple envelope, no return address. Emily opened it with fingers still streaked in soil. It read, Emily, no need to answer this. I just wanted to say thank you for staying, for not letting what came before decide what comes next. Lois. Emily held the letter for a moment, her eyes soft. Then she folded it and slid it behind the photo of Will's wife and children on the bookshelf. That evening, Hope napped in the shade of the porch. Emily sat beside her, sanding an old wooden crate to use as a planter. The radio played from the windowsill, soft, full of static, but she caught the tune anyway. You are my sunshine, my only sunshine. She hummed along without realizing it. Will watched her from the kitchen doorway. You like that song? He asked. Emily looked up. It's the first one she smiled at. Will didn't reply, but he nodded again. He stepped outside, slower than before, and handed her a small metal key on a string. It's yours to lock or open now, he said simply. Emily didn't speak. She reached out, took the key, and closed her fingers around it. A breeze rustled the leaves. Hope stirred and opened her eyes. She pushed up on both arms, then knees, and for the first time pulled herself to a stand, unsteady but upright. She took a single step forward, bare feet pressing against the edge of the quilt. Toward the garden, toward the roses. 1 year later, the town gathered again, but this time, they stayed longer. The sun cast the same golden light down the long gravel road. The same wind tickled the canvas of the booths, and the same lilac-scented air swirled around Maple Hollow's little square. But somehow, nothing was quite the same. The Spring Jubilee was an old tradition. There were years it felt routine, like a parade nobody watched. But this year, even the grass seemed greener. People lingered. They laughed deeper, hugged longer. Maybe it was because they'd nearly lost each other. Maybe it was because someone new had reminded them what staying really meant. Emily walked slowly between booths. Hope balanced on her hip, wearing a hand-sewn sun hat that kept sliding sideways. Emily's wide-brimmed straw hat shaded both their faces. She wore a linen dress second-hand, maybe, but pressed clean and cheerful in soft yellow. Hope clutched a toy horse, carved from pine and painted sky blue. Billy had given it to her that morning, whispering solemnly, "Only the bravest cowgirls ride the blue ones." Will sat on a wooden bench near the gazebo, a white shirt cleanly tucked, the top button left open. A purple ribbon was pinned crooked on his chest. Someone had insisted, and his sleeves were rolled up, catching the spring breeze. His cane rested beside him, forgotten for now. He watched Emily like a man watches the sunrise, still surprised it came back. Across the square, Lois stood behind a booth lined with embroidery floral napkins, stitched bookmarks, hand towels. She waved at Emily with a modest smile. And when Emily walked over, Lois leaned in and whispered, "You're the one who helped me see good again." Then she adjusted the baby's hat, gently, as if it were the most natural thing in the world. The pie booth drew a small crowd, and there it was. Emily's entry, a classic apple pie, but with a crust shaped into blooming roses, lightly dusted in cinnamon, golden and warm. A little card beside it simply said, "Made with quiet mornings and good soil." When the judges announced the winner, Emily laughed nervously, cheeks coloring. "Just a pie," she murmured. Will shook his head. "Just right. Near the stage. Rev." Parker cleared his throat and adjusted the microphone. "Some seeds," he said slowly, "don't grow until after the fire." The crowd hushed. Sometimes we think healing is a return to what was, but it's not. It's the making of something better. The Jubilee went on bingo games in the tent, a corner where teenagers sold lemonade. Older women danced in floral skirts with their grandkids. Music played from the community center's loudspeakers, fiddles, and soft country ballads, the kind that made you sway without meaning to. In the late afternoon, Will handed Emily a small wooden box. It was light, no lock, no hinges, just sanded smooth and engraved with one word in his handwriting, "Home." Emily turned it over once, then twice. "When did you make this bin carving it since the week you arrived?" he said. She opened the lid. Inside lay nothing but a folded scrap of paper. In Will's careful block letters, it read, "You made this a home." No other words were needed. As the sun lowered and lanterns were strung across the square, townsfolk began to gather in front of the main stage for the final speech and community awards. Lois patted Emily's arm and motioned toward the front. "You better be up there," she said. Emily furrowed her brow. "Why, Revy?" Parker smiled from the mic. "This year," he announced, "the Heart of Maple Hollow Award doesn't go to someone for years of service, or for the prettiest pie, or even the neatest garden rose." A ripple of laughter. It goes to someone who saved a life by staying, by showing up, by giving a name to something we'd forgotten how to believe in. People turned. She gave us a miracle. Rev. Parker continued. She gave us hope. Emily's eyes widened. Will nudged her shoulder. Go on, he said softly, as she stepped onto the stage. Applause rose, not loud or wild, but warm, familiar. She stood with hope in her arms, blinking at the faces that once wouldn't meet hers. People who had avoided her gaze now nodded gently. Some smiled. Billy ran forward and waved a tiny flag. Lois snapped a photo, misty-eyed. Chet clapped like thunder. When the fireworks began, small ones, legal, barely more than sparks, Hope squealed and clutched at the sky. She turned and looked at Will, who had shuffled forward with help from his cane. Papa, she said for the first time. Will didn't move at first. Then he bent down, not easily, not gracefully, and Hope reached up to hold his hand. The first firework cracked above them, gold and green against the Montana dusk. Emily didn't cry. She just closed her eyes, breathing it in, the cinnamon in the pie booth, the warmth of Hope's skin, the crowd's quiet cheering. They had stayed, and it had been enough. The fire had come and gone, but what remained was not ash, it was kindness. Quiet and steady, like new roots under scorched earth, in a town where whispers once shaped walls. It was a child's name and a stranger's courage that rewrote the story. True compassion asks for no reward, and sometimes the ones we fear the most are the ones who teach us how to stay. Like a porch light left on through the darkest nights, even the smallest act of grace can guide someone home. If this story touched your heart, perhaps there's someone nearby who just needs to be seen differently today. Thank you so much for spending your time with us today. If this story touched your heart even just a little, we'd be honored if you gave it a like, shared it with someone who needs a little light, and subscribe to our channel for more stories that speak to the soul. Your support helps us keep telling the quiet stories that matter most.